That's a tough intro. Nobody's an expert. This is such a novel tech that nobody's a true expert. But my name is Erich Dylus. I'm an attorney at Vedder Price, a few blocks away. I do aviation finance, and I'm also a member of CLC Group, which is a blockchain lab that's building on Chainlink, in particular the Honeycomb marketplace of premium APIs. And I'm here today to speak about Ricardian contracts, and then I hope to give an example from my work of actually how I stumbled across the Chainlink technology initially, and just smart contracts in general. But that's my intro.
Better than I could have done. Erich, please, take it away. I think we're going to let him talk a little bit. He's going to discuss his experience with these contracts and how smart contracts and Ricardian contracts could fundamentally alter his business. I think he made a joke earlier tonight that they could replace him, which I think is exciting, more so for us, perhaps less so for us.
Cut that out, right?
But after his presentation, I'll come back up, give him a few questions, and we'll take a few questions from the audience, and then wrap up here. Thank you again for your time. Erich, please take it.
All right. So before I begin, as I go along, I will probably speed up and get a little too excited and, ramble about things that are boring. So please let me know if you have any questions or, if something's not interesting, I've heard it before. And of course, I have to do the insufferable attorney disclaimer that everything I say is my own opinion, subject to my own experience. That's it. So I do aviation finance at Vedder Price, and that entails a lot of sales of aircraft, financing, so taking out a loan and providing a mortgage to the lender on the aircraft, operating leasing, so how the aircraft is used to airlines or other operators, and everything in between. So one of the reasons I stumbled across smart contracts in general, and specifically Chainlink, was I had this one closing that was super late at night a couple of years ago. It was with an Indian airline, and everything about the deal just was a catastrophe. Like the bank wires didn't work because it was out of banking hours in the jurisdiction where we were closing. The flight plans, we had different varying flight plans, tons of issues. To give you a little background on aviation before I give an example of how Chainlink can sort of enable these connected smart contracts. In these transactions, the example transaction I'm going to speak about is what's called a sale novation. So the owner of the aircraft is selling it to a buyer, and the aircraft is subject to a lease, is getting novated, so kind of restated in a way. And in aviation, most airlines that you're familiar with using, most of them rent their aircraft. So they don't own them, they rent them from a different entity that owns them. So typically in these transactions, you have a seller who sells an aircraft to a buyer. The buyer is also, by virtue of buying the aircraft, the new lessor of the aircraft to the lessee, which is the airline. And in order to finance the purchase of the aircraft, they'll take out a loan and subject the aircraft to a security interest or a mortgage that's in favor of the lender. So you've got a couple transfers of money and sort of rights to ownership and rights to repossession that are all moving at the same time. And to make this infinitely more difficult and confusing, one of the typical market practice or market standard is that when you do these types of transactions, you can't really materially interrupt the airline's operations. So you can't necessarily, as the buyer, tell the airline, leave your aircraft in this country for a week so we can close it and have these favorable transfer laws and registrations and tax and all this stuff. So what instead you have to do is you basically have to structure the closing around the flight schedules for this aircraft. And when you're buying a $60 million aircraft, a 10% sales tax in the country is something you want to try to avoid. It's a $6 million expense you can potentially avoid. So what a lot of these buyers do is they'll, and these flight plans change daily, but you kind of chart the flight plans and you aim to close at a time when the aircraft is over international waters. kind of have a favorable tax outcome. And if not international waters, there are other countries where, there's certain ways to avoid a tax penalty or just burdensome sales taxes in general. So it makes things very confusing. And, I as a new attorney, I generally understood why all this was happening. But at the same time, there were so many aspects of this transaction that were inefficient, really expensive, and just didn't make any sense. So, for example, one of the ways, obviously when you have such a transaction that is dependent on where the aircraft physically is when title is transferred and it's purchased, you need some sort of verification for where the aircraft is. And, you can have a spreadsheet of flight plans, and you can have some historical maps of where the aircraft flies, and you have sites like Flight Radar 24 and that sort of thing that actually track the aircraft live. And the way that it was done in this particular transaction, and we were not the entity that was responsible for this, but the way it's done is it was a screenshot, literally a screenshot of Flight Radar 24 showing the little aircraft icon over water. And I just thought, this can't be right. This is insane, right? We all think this is okay. And if a neighboring country's government comes to us and says, you owe this much in sales tax from this transaction, we're going to send them a JPEG. It's just none of this makes sense. So, and that's just one aspect of it. So, we're going to backtrack a little bit and kind of start from the beginning and where I think smart contracts enter this equation and start to automate away some of the expenses and sort of secure it and just generally make this transaction a little better. So, from the beginning, you have a suite of documents that have to do with how the aircraft is used, how rent is paid, where you can and can't use it, who's going to pay for all the attorney's fees like me, and just there's a ton of stuff that has to be covered, hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents. And I'm not saying that Chainlink is going to help to automate this away. It's not. I don't think that's really the aim. However, the things that can be a little more efficient are when you do one of these, you're transferring money, so you have to use the traditional banking system, so you have to do it within the traditional banking hours. So let's say you have a flight plan that has an aircraft going into a jurisdiction where you're willing to close for the tax, the reasons I've mentioned before, tax and transfer of title, all the legal reasons. And it only happens at 3 a.m. New York time, and you're an American buyer. So what do? So what you do is, option A is you wait until they have a favorable flight plan that's within banking hours, which, God knows when that can be, especially if it's a Singaporean airline or something that's, you just never know. Or if you don't want to do, and that's called a live funding, so you transfer money as you're switching title. So you're transferring money during the actual transfer of ownership. Or you do a pre-funding, so you send the money before to the seller, and then once the aircraft flies into the jurisdiction you want, then you release all the signatures to the documents and effect the registrations and do everything and kind of consummate the transaction, even though the money has already been sent. And so when you do that, it's called a pre-funding. So there's a live funding when you transfer money during the title, and a pre-funding when you transfer money before and just hope you close or hope you get your money back. So two scenarios that are not great for the buyer. In the pre-funding scenario, you're giving away money before you have your aircraft. And in the live scenario, you are possibly delaying for days, weeks, for the right time during banking hours, or it's just expensive in general. I mean, if you have to send a wire now and you have a bunch of attorneys and a bunch of accountants on the phone waiting for the aircraft to fly into a jurisdiction so you can get a screenshot, that costs thousands of dollars by the hour just by the billing rates. So two options that are not great. The pre-funding scenario, one of the things you do as a buyer of an aircraft, you may enter into a refund letter, which says if this transaction doesn't close in this amount of time, you have to send my money back. And, we try again, basically. Obviously oversimplified, but that's basically what it is. It's saying, you sign this legal document, that says, if this transaction doesn't close, you send my money back, we try again. And that right away should ring some bells for a perfect instance of a smart contract. Like a basic escrow contract where and I'm not going to get into the different ways you can go from fiat to crypto or use a stable coin or just ways or Chainlink to trigger certain payment triggers, whatever. I'm not going to go into the technicals of how you can do that. I'm sure Andrew could much better than me. But functionally, what you can do is you can send that money instead of to the seller or instead of to an escrow agent, which is a whole other thing. Banks charging $25,000 to hold money for an hour and then send it to someone else. You can send it to a smart contract that, upon receipt of proof that conditions are satisfied, releases the money to the seller, and if those conditions aren't satisfied, sends the money back to you. And it's essentially a trustless escrow agent. It's a smart contract address. There's no third-party risk. You're not sending it to a different bank that you also have some sort of security risk with, and payment of some fees. It's an address on the blockchain that trustlessly executes, either finishing the transaction or sending it back to you. And that's a very simple implementation that I think is just waiting to happen. And this is not just aviation too. Like there are a lot of deal closing scenarios where this could be useful. I spoke about real estate earlier, all kinds of scenarios where this could work. So from the Ricardian aspect, you have your hundreds of pages of deal documents, and then for your escrow process, you use a smart contract. You have in your sale agreement, you have a clause that's interactive with blockchain. You don't necessarily have to codify everything into the machine readable.
For the uninitiated, briefly describe what a Ricardian contract is.
Actually, I would love it if you could do that.
I'm more familiar with the folks who are working on Ricardian contracts and making them a possibility. In brief, I think about clauses implementation, which can be summed up in just a few sentences. Code is law and law as code. Something that is easily human and machine readable that can be held up in court, but also used to execute transactions. So in the case that is hundreds and hundreds of pages, but the actual transaction could be done via computer with the right framing of the right paragraph. So the part where you actually exchange the funds for a plane, that can be done very simply and in a smart contract way.
And if you go on like Open Law, for example, and play around a little bit, you'll see what looks like a traditional contract, and there will be little clauses that are in the markup language that interact with the blockchain. So functionally, it looks very similar. It just has these additional benefits to it. So, you can build from this initial implementation of a simple, smart escrow contract, and the rest of the deal is the same. And then you can start to build on the efficiencies from there. Like, instead of having the escrow contract trigger just when both parties say, okay, all signatures are in and the plane is where it needs to be, like, conditions satisfied. Now you can do it so the location of the aircraft is also fed into the smart contract. And that can be done through a number of things. You can use, GPS readings from the plane itself, but right now, you can use the APIs from Aviation Edge on the Honeycomb marketplace, or you can use the OpenSky, I believe it's testnet Chainlink, and have that be a trigger for your escrow contract. And it's much better than sending a picture, which anyone in here could, dump some blue behind the plane and say it was over water. And from there you can put in a lot more sophisticated things in these contracts. Like you can start to do loan contracts where the interest rates update to, market conditions or LIBOR or whatever trustlessly. You can do all these sorts of things. So that's what really got me excited about Chainlink, is because every time I looked into how smart contracts could make these transactions better, it ultimately came down to how external data or payment processing systems or things like that interact with blockchain. So off-chain things that interact on-chain, and you've got to go through an oracle. And it's, the centralization risk is very easily understandable. So you tell someone that the benefit of a blockchain is the fact that it's decentralized and trustless and censorship resistant and all this. And then you tell someone that there's some way that you're sending data onto the blockchain, and their immediate question is, okay, so then I just mess with the data and there's no point. And that's where Chainlink comes in. So that was a sort of basic example of a way that aviation finance is going to be, I think, I could say could be, I think, going to be upended. I don't know, I just wanted to pause if there are any questions, because I did kind of just talk at you for a while.
How do you avoid spoofed GPS data?
Well, you would want to pair it. I think you would want to, maybe you could have GPS data and the Aviation Edge API or the Open Sky. You would also want to kind of decentralize that. You want to just rely on one thing. It would be maybe, I don't know technically how to answer that, but you would definitely want more than just the single GPI or GPS input.
Probably just give every airplane its own private key.
Fair enough.
How do we know a smart contract is enforceable?
So that's a good question. That's the thing about these Ricardian contracts. If you take a legally enforceable document and change the way the payment is done, there's no these documents their enforceability isn't necessarily based on the way that one aspect of them is done. So let me think about how to answer that a little better. I think the good example is how the legal system has kind of approached digital signatures. So the rationale on a lot of the releases here is, you've got electronic signatures, which are, I don't know the exact definition, but it's basically an electronic symbol that shows that's given with intent to sign a document. And there's digital signatures, which are electronic signatures, but with a degree of authenticity, so a guarantee of authenticity behind them. And so you have these things that by their nature are very different from a wedding signature, which naturally give people pause, like why would this be enforceable? And the real question is there's so many different things that go into the validity of a signature or validity of a part of a document that are not just the document themselves. Like, who's to say I didn't forge a wedding signature and send them in and send who's to say that just the way that this payment system is kind of enacted has any impact on the payment terms of the enforceable document. But the important question is, when you have a sort of decentralized actor or decentralized organization, something like that, where do you peg the liability? And I think that's one of the more interesting questions that are currently in flux, which Open Law is doing an interesting thing with the LAO, the legally or limited autonomous organization, I think is what it stands for. And while I don't know if much about the specifics, the idea is very important, which is you automate and decentralize what you can, and you account for the meat space or human liability around it. Like you have to approach it and account for it and sort of assign it or delegate it in some way, because if there's nothing, that's when the problem arises. But in my example specifically, these, let's take the refund letter for an example, which is the agreement that, if money is sent and we don't close, you get your money back. That still works with a smart contract. It's just the process of giving and returning money is the smart contract, but the liability for you not getting your money back, that's what you approach. So that's part of the risk you take. In the same way that, if you send money to a bank, that's a third-party escrow agent, and so if a seller sends money to a third-party bank that's an escrow agent, and then the deal doesn't close, and that bank doesn't send the money back to the seller, that seller there's still a liability issue, whether or not that escrow agent is a person or a bank or an autonomous organization. Those liabilities are accounted for in the document. It's not the method of it just and this is also, subject to a lot of caveats. But there's nothing that's, in my mind, specifically preventative to that aspect being automated, because you take care of it elsewhere in the agreement.
So, do you know any regulation that are currently in the works in the government to regulate this area?
That's a lot of speculation, really, but there's a lot of encouraging work in the like I said, the digital signatures arena, which kind of naturally carries over to things like private keys and ways to prove identity and authority to enter into things. But it's kind of, I don't want to hate on the government too much, but they'll follow when they need to.
Okay. Thank you.
Take a step back in here, maybe open it up to more crowd questions after. Thank you again for talking. Quick round for Erich. I mean, obviously this kind of stuff excites me at Chainlink. You hear about how a $60 million airplane transaction secured with a screenshot can become a little bit more secure, a little bit more provable. That's the kind of stuff that this technology augurs, I think. But the crowd was starting to do this a little bit. Now that you've laid out how this currently highly inefficient, very expensive system, you have to sit with your billable hours on the phone waiting for these transactions.
Right.
What do you personally think the limits are of smart contracts and Ricardian contracts? Where can you find weakness?
Yeah, I think the obvious limit is just awareness. And, I don't think that, so there are two limits. One is overall, I think there's an awareness limit and a realization that you can do these things. And I think the second is a first mover problem, is a natural limit that someone has to build this and do this before anyone else will experiment with it. And like aviation, big one-off purchases are probably not the industry that will experiment with it, which is a shame, I guess. But I think there is a pure limitation on awareness of, you can use fiat currency triggers in smart contracts. I think people don't know that. I think, and I think there are a lot of legal questions that are, what happens when you convert these things, and like what happens tax-wise when you convert fiat to, stable coins or cryptocurrency. And, I have my own opinion on the issue that I don't think it's a barrier to entry. I don't think that is a barrier to entry, but in the way that any tax issues can be, liabilities can be allocated and risks can be compensated for, that sort of thing. I don't think that's a strict barrier to entry, but I do think it is mostly an awareness thing.
Interesting. I think I agree with you to the extent that, the transaction you described, the technology exists to do that today.
Mm-hmm.
Good job plugging Honeycomb in their data sources there. Well done. But that does lead me to my next question then. If the only thing stopping these transactions from happening today is not a technological barrier, but an awareness barrier or willingness, when do you think it's going to happen? And in your experience in the law, to what degree is there a sort of mental saturation, a knowledge that these inefficiencies could be solved?
Yeah, so, with any transition period in technology, I think there's a huge opportunity for startups and interesting, just kind of off the wall thinkers and developers to build something that, it almost makes and they understand benefits and efficiencies and how generally these things can work. But the gap between that and implementation just takes someone doing it and someone kind of taking the risk. And, from a law firm perspective, law firms are, by their nature, risk averse. They have to be. So any sort of tech innovation that law firms undertake tends to be internal. So, AI is thrown around a lot for doc review, for just generally efficient processes. And those are mostly internal process. I mean, they pass on to clients in that the costs are lower, but it's a lot of internal efficient mechanisms whereas things like smart contracts, I think that's probably going to have to come from clients. And I think it's going to have to come from the industry, because once a client says, like, we can save this much money by using smart contracts, we're going to use smart contracts. Law firms are like, I love smart contracts. Well, when do we start? Like, great. You know, obviously we have to put some caveats in our legal opinions and stuff, but like, we'll figure it out, you know? So I think the impetus comes from the people that are paying law firms money, not law firms necessarily. You know, my law firm is, you know, great. It's aviation is also a very tight-knit community. So, well, I shouldn't say, let's say small community. It's global, so tight-knit is kind of a misnomer. But once a pattern emerges and there's a new way of doing things, something that's as much of a paradigm shift as smart contracts, I think it'll catch fire. But someone has to do it.
Depending on the clients, really interesting. But we've been talking a lot right now about efficiency and about how smart contracts are going to save a whole lot of money for a whole lot of different people. I'm curious, though, maybe stepping outside your experience as a lawyer, to talk about something a little bit bigger. Do you see any sort of societal value add coming from smart contracts, coming from Ricardian contracts? How could these change the lives of people who aren't buying jets?
Right. Yeah, valid, very valid. No, I think that's the most exciting thing about it, actually. So I worked in the Small Business Administration for a little bit, and I think small businesses have a ton to gain from Ricardian contracts. Like, you think about these small enterprises that don't have the resources to go after, you know, people that don't pay their bills, or like open accounts receivable and enforcing invoice, things like this, that a lot of the trust can be removed from the equation. That's really expensive trust for small businesses that like just can't afford it and won't, you know, they won't go to take the time to go to like a small claims court or any of the proceedings that you need to do for the day-to-day annoyances where you're losing money because of trust issues and third-party issues. So I think there's a huge benefit there, and that'll be really interesting to see. And I hope the U.S. Chamber of Digital Commerce, or Digital Chamber of whichever order it is, I think they're going to realize this soon. I think there's going to be this, like, an interplay with small business in general that kind of says, like, hey, this isn't just a derivatives thing or an insurance or a you know, huge enterprise thing. Like, this is going to help all businesses generally when you remove trust costs. So I think that's pretty exciting.
Agreed. Any other thoughts generally? You know, we sort of talked about the future for smart contracts in law and in these big transactions. What do you see as the barriers to adoption in that wider space to helping, you know, getting the little guy involved in these technologies?
Barriers to adoption. I think the infrastructure is getting built out and awareness is spreading, and just you know, this is insane. Like, I thought there would be like 8 people here, and this is wild. So it's a great sign that people are paying attention and realizing that there's a like fundamental benefit to this technology that is very widespread. And as I said before, I think it's going to be some sort of risk-on lean startups and developers and people that really see some use cases and just go after them, instead of the bigger enterprises that say, like, well, we'll do a pilot for 1.5 years and then like table it and see if someone else does it first. So I think that might be a pattern that emerges.
That's the start.
I think
How much does it cost to become a master node?
We don't have master nodes. Anyone can create a node right now. There are documents to do that. We have an excellent developer community and developer advocates who are willing to help you set up a node. And there are third-party marketplaces, including, I believe, CLC.
Including Honeycomb?
Yes.
So, you know, for example, in my example where you pull aircraft locations through, you know, Aviation Edge through Honeycomb, you have to pay for that data. It's premium data. So, you know, if you were to build something using Aviation Edge now without smart contracts, just, you know, typically pulling API data from them, you have to pay for that data, whether it's a, you know, monthly fee or by you. There's there are always economic incentives here. So you pay for data, as he's mentioned, and I don't know if you want to talk about collateral or that sort of thing, but there's whenever you're transferring value and securing transactions, there has to be some skin in the game. So not going to comment on price or value of the token or anything like that, but there's just, you don't get to these structured products on free infrastructure. You have to have some sort of incentives.
I agree with you, because when you say smart contract, you said it was a smart escrow, which I think is a more accurate name, but what are the requirements for being an escrow agent?
So now, so, well, anyone can be an escrow agent, but you have to be trusted. So usually use a bank. In smaller transactions, we sometimes just use title companies or some firms that are in Oklahoma City where the FAA registry is for super small transactions. But the way it works now is you send them money, you pay them a fee to comply with the terms of the escrow agreement, which is to send the money on when the transaction is final or return it if it's not. But they keep a fee, and the fee is more than zero. It is, and you're both paying a fee and incurring a huge amount of third party risk, and it's just it's an obvious area of risk that may not be there.
What's the relationship between your company and Honeycomb and Chainlink, and what are you building right now?
What is Vedder Price going to get involved with CLC?
So I'm a member and an advisor to CLC, and what CLC is building right now, their primary focus is the Honeycomb marketplace of premium APIs. So it kind of bridges the gap between data providers who have pretty onerous terms, and also many just don't understand smart contracts, and node operators and smart contract developers who want that data for their smart contracts and their implementations and don't want to have to go to these operators themselves. And there are all kinds of areas of great friction and cost when you are going to these data providers. Like you have these onerous terms of use. They may change their endpoints and not let you know. They not allow a certain amount of calls in a given amount of time. They may only do subscription prices, so you may be paying a monthly subscription and no one may use it that month, and then you're out that money. So Honeycomb, I think is a really key piece of infrastructure that's growing, and it just provides a nice plug and play service to kind of bridge that gap. And so I think that's pretty exciting.